Welcome back, everybody. We've decided to have a very uncontroversial issue as we get later into the day, the issue of school choice in Nevada, which, as you know, everybody agrees on. But we're gonna see if there's any difference between our two guests, who I'll introduce in a second. But I'm thrilled to have Rocio Hernandez, who covers education for us and has done a great job for us covering schools. Yeah, you should applaud for her. You really should. And we have two great panelists. I have to tell you, I knew John Guedry first when he was in his other life as the former Bank of Nevada CEO, and he is in favor of school choice. And Amanda Morgan is the legal director of Educate Nevada now, who doesn't like it quite as much. Is that accurate, Amanda?
That's pretty accurate.
All right. So I'm going to let Rocio start it off.
Yeah, so I just wanted to do an introduction for people who maybe aren't, living and breathing K through 12 education as I am. So as some of you might remember, during the 2023 legislative session, and kind of usually every legislative session, the Opportunity Scholarship Program comes around, and it's always a hot button topic in Carson City. And the last legislative session, Governor Joe Lombardo tried to expand the program and make it so more students would be eligible to get one of these scholarships. But that was rejected by Democratic lawmakers. And then during the session, they also found this problem where they saw that there was certain additional one-time dollars that would be expiring for the program. Governor Lombardo did try to propose to make the program stay at its current funding level. That proposal was again rejected. So that kind of brings us to the today. So I wanted to ask you, though, John, if you could start us off by explaining what is the Opportunity Scholarship Program. It's been called a voucher program in the past, but talking with you backstage, you seem to disagree with that.
Well, yeah, first off, it's not a voucher program. It's a tax credit program. And it was set up specifically that way so that it wouldn't take money from the education fund. So the way the state funds it, and let me just give a little bit further back history, if I could. In 2015, when we saw a large tax increase, about a $1.3 billion tax increase under Governor Sandoval, a significant portion of that, roughly $900 million, went to K through 12 and higher education. Part of that, a very small part of that, was a fund for $5 million that would grow 10% every year. And that $5 million was a tax credit program that worked just like this. Commerce tax, which is a payroll tax, is paid by every business, every for-profit business that has a payroll, and that business could elect to defer a portion of their payroll tax to this program, as opposed to the general fund, which is where the funds would have gone, not the education fund, but the general fund. And the $5 million was quickly used. We got to a point where each year when it grew 10%, it got as high as $6.6 million. We had roughly 2,000 or over 2,000 students that were using that program. Key point to note is the cost of that was, for the state, was right around $6,000 per student, which was less than what they were funding for the public education system, which is a catastrophic failure. And I hope we spend a little time talking about why we're even having this conversation, which is the failure of the Clark County School District. But at the end of the day, in 2019, when leadership changed, had a new governor and had new legislative direction from a different party, they capped that. So they capped it at the $6.6 million. And since then, there's been some additional funding. It's one-time funding, roughly about $4 million, that allowed the students that were already in the program to continue to stay in that program. So today, there's roughly 1,000 students in that program. And frankly, it's really a very small portion. So the fact that we're having a conversation about something that affects 0.003% of the student population is kind of mind-boggling to me when we have such major problems in our education system. But I respect the concerns about the potential of pulling money away from the public school system. I hope we do have a chance to talk a little bit about how much they throw away every year. So I'll stop there and we can pick up later.
Yeah, I'd love to comment on that. So first off, I would love if in public education we had an automatic 5 to 10% increase every session. That just doesn't happen. We've barely kept up with inflation over the past 20 years. And in fact, back in the 1970s, we funded at the national average in public education, and now we're about 46th to 48th, depending on the year. So we have seen a steady decline in education funding over the past 45 years. So sure, you can underfund and overregulate a system for the past 50 years and point to it and say, wow, that's not working. Well, of course it's not. It's been starved for so many years. So I commend the legislature for starting to make serious investments in public education, but we can't expect a turnaround in 1 year. There was a really important investment of about $1 billion a year over the next 2 years, this last legislative session, and that's incredible. But I want to be very clear about opportunity scholarships. They are, in fact, a voucher. They are public tax dollars going to private schools at the end of the day. There was a lot of polling and investigation done on why the public was really anti-voucher. And so there's been a big effort to rebrand what they are, and opportunity scholarships is part of that rebranding. But essentially, it's the foot in the door for states to eventually expand to what are called universal vouchers. So those are vouchers for every single private schooler in the state. They've already started to do that here. So we have opportunity scholarship. Yes, right now it's kind of a small program. That's largely due to the efforts of people that have fought against the expansion of this program. The last legislative session, there was an effort to increase eligibility. So it's supposed to be for low-income families, but they're trying to edge up that eligibility to higher income families. But in other states, we have seen opportunity scholarships grow to the point where they are full-blown vouchers. They've blown planet-sized holes in state budgets, $1.4 billion in Arizona, $1 billion in Ohio, $1 billion in Indiana. These programs grow, and I'll tell you, the majority of people taking advantage of these programs are wealthy families that are already in private schools. So yeah, I do raise alarm bells when we start having voucher programs in the state, because I know that our public schools need those tax dollars more than private schools.
Given those concerns, John, why do you think the program should be allowed to grow?
Well, I'm going to go back to, it's not a voucher. A voucher by definition means that they're taking funds out of the education budget, and they didn't do that. It is a tax credit program. But aside from that, let's talk about the budget for a second. So in 2015, we saw, as I said, roughly $900 million go into education, another $62 million in 2019, and then this most recent increase of $1 billion a year for the next 2 years. If you look back from the 1960s to the early 2010s, we had a 66% increase in our education budget. That's after adjusted for inflation. So we didn't keep up with inflation. It's just a fallacy. It's not true. I'm sorry, but I can provide the data to Mr. Ralston to put out there. And then since 2015, we've seen a 62%. So we've rapidly increased the funding. The problem that we're having in the education system isn't so much funding. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be more funding. And part of the reason I'm not saying that is I don't know that we have really accurate data from anywhere, including our own state. Up until 2019, what I heard was we were funding out at roughly $7,100 per student. That was the number. And then we did the new funding formula under Senators Woodhouse and Dennis, and they hired Jeremy Aguero and Applied Analysis to come in and do an assessment of what the revenue stream actually was. And what his report showed was it was north of $10,500, and he even stated, I don't know that I've accounted for every source of revenue for the state, and for the district. And so if we can't trust our own numbers or what's coming out of our education system or the legislature, how do we trust 49 other states and DC? I don't know. So I'm going to say I will defer to the experts on whether we are appropriately funded, but I will say, and I don't think my colleague would disagree with me here, we wastefully spend so much money. I'll give one example and I'll stop, and there's multiples. On 2015, I served on the SAGE Commission. We took a look at spending both at Clark and Washoe County. This is on the capital side, but it happens on the operating side, and I can give examples of that as well. On the capital side, we were spending $30 million to build a new elementary school. That's for roughly an average of 850 students. There was a for-profit company, Turner Agassiz, that was building schools here in town, and roughly the same period of time in the same year, they built a functionally identical or functionally same building. It had all the same capabilities for K through 8 and licensed for 1,000 students, and it cost $11.1 million. There was no checks and balances in the system, in the Clark County School District system. We are throwing so much money away because nobody's accountable for it. We have educators trying to run then 2015, a $900 million, now it's north of $1 billion business services budget, and they have no expertise in construction and food service and transportation, facilities maintenance. I mean, you can go through the list. And so before you throw more money in a bucket that's got holes all over it and watch the money fall out, I'd say we have to get controls on that, and they have to recognize that there's accountability with that money. We gave them that $900 million, and then 2 years later, the CCEA was lined up to testify why we should lower teacher performance evaluation standards on student outcomes. It was 40%. They were weighted 40%. By 2019, they passed it, lowered it to 15%. By 2021, it's 0. Literally, a teacher has 0 accountability for student improvement and student measurements. So I'm not opposed to funding more dollars, but I think we've got to fix what's broken so that we're actually running this like a business, because it is. It's a multi-billion-dollar-a-year business, and we don't run it that way.
So let me jump in here a second, because Rocio, you managed to elicit like 12 different issues with your first question from both of them. John, I didn't remember you being able to talk that fast and get in that much. That's very, very impressive.
Practice.
There you go. But here's one thing I want to get to first, and let's get it out of the way, because I want to separate some of these issues. And so, man, I want you to address this. You know, labels matter, but the actual policies matter too.
Sure.
And vouchers, tax credits, they can be confusing. There's a fundamental difference, and I want you to address this, man, because you said it is a voucher program. I don't care what you call it, but there's a fundamental difference between opportunity scholarships and what they do and education savings accounts, which clearly are vouchers and should be labeled vouchers. That's a different policy, is it not?
No, because you still have to budget for that tax credit. So those are funds that would be collected and would be going to the state government. So
you're saying, just let me, before you get going, I just want to make sure that everyone here understands. You're saying either way it takes money from public education.
It takes money from state government.
Government.
Yeah, so I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to come out of the district budgets, although efforts in the past have been made to do that, and those were overturned by the courts, thankfully. But you know, opportunity scholarships, fundamentally what they do is take dollars that would have been going to the state government and are putting them into private education. It's interesting to talk about accountability and transparency and wanting to make sure that's all in place before we give money to a program. If I were to go into a legislator's office tomorrow and say, hey, you know, I want to start this program and I don't really want it to be transparent on where the funds are going. I don't really want to know if it's working or not. I don't really want to track outcomes. And I just kind of want you to trust me, bro. You'd be laughed out of that office. And that's exactly what these programs are. Opportunity scholarships, I'll tell you right now, opportunity scholarships, these schools are supposed to give their students an assessment. They get to pick whatever assessment they want to do. It doesn't have to be the same ones that public schools do. 80% of students are not being reported by private schools, 80% of students taking opportunity scholarships. We have no clue what's happening with those students. So if you want to start talking about accountability, let's start there. I couldn't tell you where the money's going. I couldn't tell you if it's going to students, if it's going to a new car, which has happened in other states. So I mean, if we're going to talk about accountability and transparency, let's talk about it all around.
Happy to do that. The state Department of Education does regulate the private school sector as well. They can have their licenses pulled. Private schools fail. When they fail to deliver a product that's acceptable to the parents and to the students, they go out of business. Public schools, they flourish when they fail. We failed. We failed because we didn't have enough money. Well, let's give you some more money. We failed again because we didn't have enough money. Well, let's give them some more money. And that's been the history, not just here, but public schools around the country. And I don't understand why we worry about a voucher or a tax credit going to a private school, but we don't want to even have a conversation about how much money's flowing literally out of the education budget from the district to charter schools. It's the same argument. The same argument is we're trying to give students that have been stuck in poor performing schools, that are zoned for those schools, have parents that can't transport them somewhere else, and that's the only option they have. We're trying to give them other options. And this is just one other option. And by the way, today, I'm not saying where it will go. That's something that we'll all have to debate. But today, it's for low-income families. It's 300% of poverty level. And right now, the program has the students that are in it, the family of four, average salary is $48,000. It's 70% of the students in the program are minority students. These are students that would have no other option but to be stuck in a poor-performing school. And we can, again, talk about why we have such poor performing schools, especially in minority neighborhoods and low income.
But states that are actually tracking outcomes for these opportunity scholarship and these low income students that are taking advantage of these programs are finding that they're performing the same or worse.
That's
in
not the
core
studies
academic-
I've read.
Okay,
Sorry.
but
There's
that's just
over 50 studies that support that they're performing much better.
I haven't
Much.
seen one of those for vulnerable
send them
student
to you.
groups. Okay, I'd be happy to read those because I've
Perfect.
studied this thoroughly. But let's talk about the quality of these private schools. So in a lot of states that have created voucher programs, they've popped up in these states, there's a thing that's called a pop-up private school. Some people call them strip mall schools. And when a voucher program is introduced into a state, these are schools that open up specifically to take advantage of the voucher program. Some of these schools are 100% funded by vouchers. And they did a great job in Milwaukee of tracking how these schools do. And the majority of these pop-up schools closed down within 4 years. These are not good environments for students. All right, this isn't them escaping a failing school and then going to, I mean, in our state, we're thinking like Bishop Gorman or Las Vegas Day School. That's not what's happening. These voucher dollars still don't provide those students an opportunity to go to what we would call a prestigious private school in the state. These students are going to school, and I would say that they're failing here, but they haven't even provided the data, so I couldn't even tell you what's happening here. But I do think it's suspicious that 80% of students are not being reported at all by these private schools.
So throw the baby out with the bathwater. So we basically have students that do benefit from it, but now let's take that program away from those students because we have some failed schools. Put restrictions in place. Lobby for that. I'll go up there with you to Carson City, and we can lobby for that so that they are meeting standardized requirements. The problem is that right now they're stuck in no option. I mean, literally, I'm in a failing. When Governor Lombardo asked for the additional $5 million from CARES Act and there was testimony given, I sat there and listened to a 13-year-old girl, and I know this is anecdotal, but I think this is more common than we think. Talk to a group of adults that had to make a decision on whether or not they were going to give that $5 million to continue to fund the program at the level that, frankly, not even at the level that, frankly, Governor Sandoval had approved. And she said, I left the school I was in because every day I was bullied, and I felt like I had no options but to kill myself. And she had that conversation with her mother, and fortunately her mother found out about the Opportunity Scholarship, got her into a school where her words was thriving, straight A student, involved with student government and a bunch of other activities. And then she said, please don't send me back there. And of course they didn't approve it. And so it's become such a political issue as opposed to a practical issue. It should be a practical issue. Everything we do on education, we've got to get politics out of the way and focus on children. It's not that. It's always about the adults, and it's always about how we can benefit CCEA and who they got elected. And you know this. I mean, we've spent time up in Carson City, and we see what CCEA does, the teachers union does, in controlling what happens in the halls of Carson City. So we've got to stop that and start making it about the kids. I'm fine with saying let's work to improve the system, but let's not throw a system out that gives a kid an option that didn't have an option before. My grandchildren have that option. I'm fortunate, we're blessed that we're able to give our grandchildren an opportunity to go to private schools. They went their first 5 years to the public school system, but frankly, we were afraid of them staying in that system. I think every kid should have that option.
So like you mentioned, right now the program as it is primarily helps families from low-income backgrounds attain this opportunity to go to private schools that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise been able to with their own resources. In 2023, Governor Lombardo proposed not only increasing the program, but expanding it to students of families in households at 500% of the federal poverty line, which for a family of 4 is $150,000. Do you agree that the program should be expanded beyond what it is right now? As you mentioned, these heartbreaking stories of families from low-income households who wouldn't have otherwise have this opportunity without this program.
Amanda or me? I feel like I'm talking too much, so I'm happy to answer that. I don't necessarily agree with the 500% level. I've been a proponent of lower income families. I still am a proponent of lower income families. Until we've addressed the needs of lower income families, I would suggest that we keep that level at where it is today. As far as the funding, I think we need to expand it. When you talk about a program that currently impacts less than 1/3 of 1% of the student population, it's not having an impact. It should. it should be more readily available, and it should be more readily available for the families that don't have that option. So no, I don't agree with the 500% level. I would keep it at 300%, but I would say that we need to find a way to continue to expand it without taking money from the public education system. And we didn't do that in 2015. I wouldn't propose that we do that going forward. Frankly, we, in 2015, gave the public education system a lot of additional money, and I just want to share one story because I think everybody should know this. $460 million of that money went to Zoom and Victory schools. Zoom schools are English language learning schools, so students that are coming from non-English language households, or it's their primary language, and Title I students or students in poverty. That money went to the students. Initially, it went to schools, and then they figured out how to account for it, to have it follow the students like the legislature intended for it to do. And so what does the district do? They account for teacher salaries based on average salaries. So it was a change from a direct cost to now an average cost. And what does that mean? Well, it means that a school in Summerlin that has the most experienced teachers paying the highest salaries gets a deduction on their charges for salaries because they're going to just pay those teachers the average salary. And a school in North Las Vegas that has the lowest income teachers with the least amount of experience and the highest percentage of substitute teachers sees an increase in their cost for salaries because they're getting charged the average as opposed to the actual. It was just a way to shift the money to where they wanted it to go. And CCA didn't have a problem with that. I personally have a big problem with that.
I 100%. Oh yeah, I totally agree that we need to transition to actual teacher salaries because right now low-income schools are subsidizing wealthier schools, hands down. So we're in agreement on that issue, 100%.
So these are the kind of things when I talk about fixing the problem before you throw more money at it, we need to fix these things. We need to have, this is the perfect time. We've got a new superintendent position open. We should put pressure on the Board of Trustees to hire someone that understands that you run a multi-billion-dollar business. That business has customers, something that they've never understood. Those customers are the students, their parents, and the communities they serve. And they should have a mission statement that says exactly in a measurable, articulate way what they're going to do to serve those customers. What's going to happen when a student graduates? Are they going to be career ready? Are they going to be college ready? Or are they going to be ready for life after 12th grade? And that should be measurable standards. And then they should have, action plans, or they should have goals and objectives that reach that mission, and they should have action plans to get there, and they should have competition because competition is the only way they're going to get better. If they're a monopoly, no other business can operate as a monopoly. If I was a bank and I operated as a monopoly, the government would come in and threaten to close us down and fine us.
So is this your campaign to become the next superintendent?
No, no, thank you. My wife said you'd probably ask that, so she's smarter than I am.
But
I'm not an academic.
You walked into it. You are talking too much, so I want Amanda to talk.
I'm done.
I'm kidding. So if there were more transparency, and you've talked about the lack of transparency, and it were shown opportunity scholarships do work, that these kids are getting better outcomes, would you then support them?
Well, let's talk about charters. Right now, I could tell you how many licensed educators are in a charter. They're taking the same standardized test as traditional public schools. I could tell you the incidence of bullying. I could tell you a lot about what's happening at a charter, and that's not why I'm up here saying charter's bad, we shouldn't have charters. They've been open to that kind of transparency. There's still room for improvement. I don't think they've done a very good job with our special education population, so I think that there's work to be done there, especially high-need special education population. So I think that there's room for improvement, but it's easy for us up here to say, like, yeah, if they do all these things, then it'll be good. Voucher proponents have fought hard against any sort of accountability, and you see it even with the reporting data that's coming in from private schools. We have heard reports that private schools just don't think they should have to report that data on principle. We're a private school, we shouldn't have to report outcome data. So that's kind of what we're up against right now. So yeah, we can have an in-depth discussion on, when do we finally have kind of that accountability and when do we kind of feel good about that. But you talk about competition, which I think is really interesting. We have to remember something. Private schools don't have to take every student. People kind of call it school choice. It's actually the school's choice. If your student is transgender, has a different sexual orientation than you think is appropriate, if your student has special education needs, is an English learner, requires additional resources. There's a variety of reasons that a private school could just say, you're not the right student for our group. You just don't fit in with our student populations. Public schools have to take every student as they come. So if we want to have competition, are we going to enforce anti-discrimination measures on our private schools? Is that something that those schools are willing to do? If you want to have true competition, we have to play we're not playing by the same rules. We're not even playing the same game at this point. So I think there's a lot to be done for us to have some parity between our traditional public schools and our private schools.
I don't disagree. Do you want to fund the private schools at the same level you fund the Clark County School District?
Well, right now they're
receiving.
receiving.
Want to give them $12,000 a student because it's averaging $6,000.
No, it's not. It's
It
actually
is. I'm sorry.
$9,800.
We'll get the data from the state.
Okay.
It's just over.
I just looked it up, so it's
But-
$9,800.
That's how much they can get.
Wait a
That's
second,
the
though.
maximum.
Wait a
It's
second. I'm going to
averaging
let
6.
someone who really understands these issues, Rocio, take over in a second. But, John, you can't seriously argue. I mean, you can play games with numbers, 9,800, 12,000, whatever the number is, and there are different ways to calculate that number, by the way. But I have never seen any study show anything but that Nevada is near the bottom of the funding pool. You can say 46th, 48th, 49th. We're still very, very low. Do you acknowledge that?
I don't know. That's an honest answer. I don't know, and I've spent 25 years looking at this. I honestly don't know. And in large part because of the data that we get from our own district. So I don't have confidence in that because it constantly is a moving target.
But they're audited all the time.
Fine. What's the audit tell them? How we compare with other states?
No, but the audit says how much they're spending on each student. It does show that.
When you have somebody with the intelligence level of Jeremy Aguero spend 9 months taking a look at all their revenue sources and saying, I don't know that I can account for everything, then you got a problem. So yeah, the governor's right in looking at wanting to do an audit. And I don't disagree with my colleague here. I do think that the private schools should have the same requirements. If they're going to receive state funds, they should have the same requirements as the public school system, whether that is the district or it's the charter schools. But in reality, we underfund the charter schools. We underfund, in those cases, I can say we underfund because I can compare them directly to the Clark County School District, and they don't get the same level of funding. So it is kind of, it's like saying, to your point, well, a private school who gets $6,000, which is the average scholarship, gets $6,000, charges $15,000, they've got to fund the difference. And they've got to provide transportation, and they've got to provide all of the things that the public school system has. Well, they don't get a capital budget. They don't get $11,500. So if you want to do parity, let's do parity. Let's say, let's fund it fair, and then hold them to the same standards.
Then they're public schools.
What's that?
Then they might as well be public schools if you're going to do that, right?
Well, frankly, right now the scholarship program has 71% minorities using it. So to say that they don't, have the same type of student is just blatantly false. They have a very similar demographic. I can't disagree that they should have the same standards. So let's push for that. But again, you don't stick a kid in a failing school and say, sorry, I can't give you another option. Charter schools, frankly, haven't been an option because up until the 2023 session, there was no capital available to charter schools. So how do I buy a school bus to be able to transport a kid because their parent can't transport them? So let's make it pari passu across the board and hold everybody to the same standards, and I'm good with that. But to say, let's just throw the program out because it doesn't meet certain requirements of the public school system, which we know is failing miserably.
Well, I just think every single student deserves a quality, well-funded neighborhood public school, first and foremost.
Don't disagree.
And if we talk about, let's talk about capital funding. I'm really thrilled that the legislature came out with really creative solutions to provide capital funding to charter schools. Great move. There's a low-income loans, there's grants, there's all these things happening. Good for them, not complaining about that. But I'll tell you right now, here in Nevada, there are traditional public schools that were built during the Woodrow Wilson administration. Okay, there are kids in schools that have lead piping, asbestos, no heating, no air conditioning. These schools have been verified by third parties at risk of catastrophic failure. So it's great to have creative solutions for charter schools or even private schools with the right accountability in place, but we also need to recognize that there's a finite amount of dollars in the state. What are we going to do for our traditional public schools? And I'll tell you, these are in rural counties where they could tax the heck out of themselves, and it's mathematically impossible for them to build these schools.
I 100% agree with you, and you just made my case. The reason that those schools are falling apart is because we build $30 million elementary schools that a for-profit private company could build for $11 million, and we won't even consider that option because the unions would never let us consider that option. And instead of having money go to repairing air conditioning and fixing windows and roofing and structural issues with buildings, 80% of it goes to pay back the bonds on the schools that are less than 20 years old because we way overbuilt. Well, where are those schools located? They're not in North Las Vegas. So I agree with you. But again, I'm just saying, fix the problems that we have before you dump more money and make the problem even bigger. And then if you fix the problems and it's determined that we are underfunded, we're one of the worst, then fix that. But in order for me to get comfortable with it, and again, I've spent a lot of time looking at this, in order for me to get comfortable with it, you're going to have leadership in a district that actually understands their responsibility. They need to be accountable. They can't take $900 million and say, hey, the teachers don't have any responsibility to see that students improve. That's just wrong.
I want to say, I think that the district has built schools in North Las Vegas. I think last year, went to Northeast Career and Technical Academy, and if I remember correctly, there's another school coming in the works, so I do think that the district, at least here locally, is investing somewhat up north. But I also did want to ask you, Amanda, what consequences have you seen in states that have gone to more of a universal approach, opening up this program to, that maybe started also like us, serving low-income students? Has that bred competition with the traditional school districts? What kinds of students do they serve?
So that's a great question because I just researched that. So no, the answer is no. It hasn't magically helped public schools. In fact, what we've seen is in some states, tens, hundreds of millions, and even $1 billion transition to private schools. And I kind of we're talking about the what ifs of what could happen here in Nevada if we transition to universal vouchers. That it's not really a what if. There was a concerted effort with an initiative petition to change the Nevada Constitution to require the state to fund every single student in a private school. So before a single student escaped their failing public school or whatever, however you want to frame it, we would have footed the bill for $400 million for wealthy families that already have their kids in private schools. So this isn't kind of, being worried that something might happen in the future. These are efforts that are happening right now here in Nevada. We were luckily able to defeat that in the courts. But in other states, they don't know what to do in Arizona. $1.4 billion to private school vouchers. It's catastrophic for state budgets. And they're doing the research and they're finding the people that benefit, to your question on who's benefiting from this, the majority of people taking advantage of vouchers are people who already have their kids in private school. So I don't really see how that's going to help our failing public education system to funnel hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to students that are already in private school.
Yeah, so Arizona is a great example of a failed system, and it's a great example of a failed system that became political, and that's what it was about. We had a legislature that wanted one thing and a governor that wanted something else, and both sides wouldn't give, and ultimately we got a convoluted, messed up program. I would not recommend that we follow that program. I actually feel like the kind of things we're talking about here is how we build the right program, and there are states that are successfully running these programs. I find it fascinating, though, that the data that you're reading says that the students in these private schools aren't doing any better, because it's a hardship for the parents to get their kids into these private schools. In some cases, the private school does require the parent to fund some portion of the tuition and or volunteer time or do other things, certainly transport their kids to school. If they're not getting the education that they feel that they deserve, why are they staying there and why are they continuing to take the scholarship programs unless the alternative is so much worse?
Well, for 80% of families here in Nevada, we don't know. We heard testimony by scholarship granting organizations.
You can use common sense.
Yeah, I'll tell you, we don't even need to use common sense. We have it from the horse's mouth. We heard scholarship granting organizations saying that they're losing students because the program's not working for them, Because even with the voucher, they can't go into a quality private school. They're going into these pop-up schools. They're not improving. I mean, we want to funnel into a program, and 80% of students, we have no idea if they're staying in. You say, why are they staying? We don't know if they're staying. We don't know if they're improving.
Let's look at one reason they're losing students. We had a legislature that said not only are we capping the amount that we were going to increase each year, but we're not going to allow a student that leaves to be replaced. So that was their way of basically dissolving the program, is just as they graduate or they leave or they move out of the state, nobody else can replace it. So let's be at least intellectually honest about that.
Yeah.
And that's part of the problem.
I'll tell you what another part of the problem is, and why there was a big issue this last legislative session when it came to opportunity scholarships, and kind of the illustration of the shady practices that are happening with these dollars. There was funds allocated. It wasn't less funds. There were funds there for these students. One scholarship granting organization from Florida, which I don't even know how they're allowed to operate here because it's supposed to be a Nevada-based organization, flew into town the day that those funds were released, stood in line at the state office, and took every single dollar of those scholarships for their organization, even for students that they didn't have or didn't need to fund that year. And so we ended up with a bunch of folks at the interim finance committee saying, oh, my kid's losing their voucher. It must be because the legislature didn't fund it. That wasn't the case. The case is there was one shady scholarship granting organization that took all the funds even though they didn't need them.
So cut them off.
Yeah.
Remove them. I mean, again, we could sit here and talk about what's flawed in that program. And frankly, it's so small to fix the flaws are much easier than what's flawed in our public education system, where the flaws are so massive, it's going to take us some time to fix those. So I'm not opposed to anything that you're saying where we are falling short, going back and fixing where we're falling short. What I'm opposed to is saying to a child that's stuck in a failing school and a failing district, you're stuck. Sorry. You weren't born in the right family, so you don't get that opportunity.
So by that logic, what about his classmate?
All of them, which is why I say we should be continuing to look to grow this for families that can't afford it and fix it where it's broken.
Amanda, do you feel like there's ever a way, is there any reforms that could be made to make the Opportunity Scholarship Program here something that you would be comfortable seeing as permanent? Or do you feel like it should just be scrapped altogether?
Well, we've kind of talked a little bit about some of the accountability measures. I'd want to know where those dollars are going and how they're supporting students. I'd want the students to be taking the same standardized tests as their public school peers, so we know that when they use the program that they're actually improving, or if they're not improving. I'd want schools to be subject to the same non-discrimination requirements as traditional public schools. So there's a lot that can be done. But let's be clear, there's almost no accountability measures now, and private schools are failing to comply. So I don't know if we're ever going to get to that.
Well, but it's beyond that, isn't it, Amanda, in the sense that they could do everything that you're asking and be more transparent and accountable, but that does not get past the taking public money, taking tax dollars from the state to pay for private schools. You'll never support it for that reason. I'm not saying it's a bad reason, but you'd never support it for that reason.
Look, if we have, like I said, if every student has an adequately funded, quality neighborhood public school, I'm all for experimenting with anything. Let's go for it. Let's try anything. We're not even close. I mean, you talk about 10,000 per pupil. The national average is, no, I'm talking about for public schools.
It's actually 11, almost 12.
The national average is about 16,000. That's just the middle road. That doesn't even account for what studies have recommended, like expert recommendations based on what students would need to have the opportunity to succeed. I'm being very generous just talking about the national average.
I'm going to take your word for it because I haven't seen anything that validates any of the numbers, including with our own school district. So, we can throw any numbers we want out there. Let's say you're right and it's 16 and we're at 12, and then we factor in things like no personal tax, income tax, and other adjustments for cost of living, and maybe we're $3,000 apart. And so maybe that's the gap we need to close. All I'm saying is before you close that gap, fix where we're wasting hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's not an exaggeration. Where we're wasting that, fix the accountability measures. Make sure that when they receive funds, they understand that comes with an acknowledgement and understanding that you have to perform. You can't have 83% graduation rate and only 27% of the entire student population are career and college ready. That's an actual number. 27%. We failed 73% of the kids that we just pushed out into their adult life and said, good luck.
I just think it's interesting that these kind of school choice advocates, for the past, like I said, for the past 50 years, we have seen our state slide from funding at the national average to being 46th or 48th. Those are real numbers. I mean, you can try to deny the numbers. Those are real numbers. I've talked to Jeremy Aguero. I watch every Commission on School Funding meeting. I've investigated this stuff myself. I mean, you do that to a system, and and then you point to it and say, that's not good for students. We need this new system. It seems like a disconnect to me.
But here's the problem. The problem, in my opinion, are the politicians, right? They're the ones who have caused this. The legislature, with some exceptions, has basically just put Band-Aids on this problem, not really had a vision for how do we fix this. So, Amanda, I guess I'm wondering, it's their fault. I really think it's their fault. But do you understand why parents of low-income children might be so frustrated by having watched this and having their kid come home and say, we didn't have a textbook, or that we couldn't afford certain things? Why they would say, this makes sense to me. Do you understand that?
Oh, absolutely. But I think those same parents would want to know if the school that they're choosing has licensed educators, whether their students are actually achieving. We could have a parent that wants to send their kid to Flat Earth Academy. I mean, yeah, they might really like that school, but education has a purpose. We want to make sure kids are college, career, and community ready. So, let's investigate those things. Let's understand what's happening at these schools. And that's not just for the taxpayer's sake. I think that a parent would appreciate that as well. So, we can start talking about those measures. It's just, it's interesting up here to say like, oh, well, yeah, we're open to those kind of accountability measures. Hasn't been my experience at legislative session, quite frankly.
Well, let's change that, but let's also say if we're gonna say that they need to meet certain standards, then everybody needs to meet them. You're talking about licensed educators. Do you realize how many educators we have at the district that are not licensed?
Yeah,
I mean, literally, there's.
yeah, I know because there's data on that.
We're running out of time here, and I want Rocio to wrap this up, but I do want to ask John a question here, because it's kind of like we're talking around this issue, and here's what the real issue is with school choice, in my opinion. You can disagree with me, it's allowed. This is a surrender to, the best lobbyist for school choice is the Clark County School District, right? Because all the headlines and the dysfunction and among the board, and suddenly there's huge holes and they don't know where the hole came. They are a great lobbyist for school choice. However, school choice is also a surrender to the notion that public education has failed. It's not working anymore. And so you can do the 0.03% thing and all the rest of it. The goal is to get universal school choice, which destroys the public school system.
Well, John, one, I don't normally disagree with you, but I'm going to have to disagree.
I figured you might.
Yes, that's part of it, but there's a bigger part of it, and that is not everything is a one-size-fits-all for students. Within the district, we have magnet school programs. That's a good example of trying something different.
MAGA school? Oh,
Magnet school, which is a good example of trying something different. MAGA.
You see what I cover all the time. Go on.
Anyway, trying something different than the traditional public school system. It's a focused effort on study of an interest for a particular child. For some kids, it's I'm in an oversized classroom, so maybe that's a funding issue. Maybe it's just a management issue, and maybe we're just too big of a school district. So some of it is the district, and some of it is each child has certain needs that one size doesn't fit all. Some private schools, some faith-based private schools fit a particular family's needs better than a non-faith-based. Some non-faith-based fit a particular family's needs better than a faith-based. Okay. So it's really giving options. The same choice that we all have as adults, and as you know better than anybody, has become a major ballot issue or a major issue in this election. We need to give similar choices to students so that they can thrive, not so that they are stuck in something that is a one-size-fits-all solution.
We're running out of time. I want Rocio to wrap it up with the final question.
Sure.
Let's see. There's so many questions. I know when we were backstage, we were talking about some commonalities between you two and some bright spots maybe that you both see in K through 12 education interstate. Anything give you optimism?
Well, I think that our agreement that work needs to be done at CCSD, and I'm really encouraged by the addition of appointed board members. That's something that we see in a lot of other larger districts across the country that have really been effective. And as a dork that watches a lot of school board meetings, I can tell you that there's definitely a more professional, kind of professionalism at the board. I'm looking forward to the coming session on efforts to give those board members more authority. I don't think that they quite have the authority they need. So I'm hopeful for things like that. I totally agree with you on the average teacher salaries versus actual teacher salaries. So there is commonality, and maybe we can go up there and fight for better regulation for vouchers.
Yeah, look, man, Amanda, I'm open to the idea of additional funding, and I hope that we can find some common ground on how we get to that to make sure that it's spent properly. There's accountability for it. There's accountability on how it's spent and what results need to come from it. Because I'm not opposed to that. I'm also not opposed to tightening the requirements of any school, public or private, that receives public funds, meeting whatever standards all schools are required to meet. But that's all schools. That's
Okay.
the public school system and otherwise.
All right, I have a dream.
Ah,
My dream is that Amanda and Superintendent Guedry are up there together at the table arguing for some of these reforms. I want to thank both of you, and I want to thank Rocio for being on this panel. Thanks a lot. It's been a great panel.
thank you. Yeah,
Thank
enjoyed
you.
it. Thank you.